Hello and welcome back to Raw Sport Weekly, the fourth F1 special that we've done. And what that basically means is a whole show devoted to F1. Yes, I am your host and head of sport, Josh Sim. Thank you so much for watching along. This is pre-recorded, so we're doing this on Wednesday. This will go out on the Thursday in time ahead of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this weekend. Today we're just gonna go through Bahrain, all the events that happened in Bahrain, starting with the Bahrain Grand Prix that was 2 weeks ago, and then Sakir, that was the weekend that's just concluded as well. So as well as all the news that has come out about driver lineups and all sorts of news, especially I think it was one day on Wednesday where all the news dropped at like 7-8 a.m., which is really weird for F1. I'm not gonna lie, it's a weird time, I guess. Time in the day to get all that news, but it all came out, so we'll talk about it all. As usual, quick reminder, in the video description, all our social media links are there as well, and you would have just had today, or at least yesterday on Wednesday, the interview with Dan O'Hagan has just dropped on the YouTube channel. Dan O'Hagan being a freelance football commentator. You'd have heard his voice on Match of the Day in the past. Obviously, he does Champions League and Europa League games for BT Sport, does the Bundesliga, Chinese Super League. He was a really interesting guy to talk to, and it was a really enjoyable conversation. Obviously, we pre-recorded the conversation a week ago, so apologies if some of the stuff we talk about is a little out of date. But yeah, he talked about how his career. He talked about what it's like to be a commentator, why a lot of commentators tend to handwrite all their notes as opposed to printing them out and typing them out. You see a lot of commentators a lot of pen, really colorful, really well decorated sort of notes. And so we just had a chat about it, and also about his beloved Wolves team and how they're doing this season as well. Yeah, really enjoyable conversation that is out on our YouTube channel and also the Spotify podcast feed, or wherever you get your podcasts. It's on the podcast feed as well, which you can kind of watch, or listen to, give a rating, subscribe to the feed, all kind of stuff like that. So without further ado, let's talk Bahrain. So let me bring on my two guests with me. We have, as ever, now I have to say former deputy. Well, department stalwart, legend of the station. Oh, goodness. I'm going to have to think of a new title for this. It's Joe Spagnoli.
You've said legend of the station, so like Pin-Up Boy of Raw 12:51am, which is now in my Twitter bio, you've said it, so now it's official. Good afternoon, Josh.
No do-overs, right?
No, if you've said it, it's been confirmed, no.
Okay, well, it is. I guess that tag stays until when I vacate my head of sport role, and then the next head of sport has to then think of a new title for you. Also with us, the host of the Alternate View and just general F1 enthusiast, I guess. Cam Hall joins us as well.
Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been you haven't been on one of these for a while, I feel like.
It's been a rather crazy month. Obviously, we've got Alternative View. I've got taken on the breakfast show as well over the last month as well. So it's been rather crazy, but it's nice to get back and talk about F1 again.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's a lot, and there is a lot to talk about. In fact, full disclosure to people listening or watching, I originally envisioned this as going to be one big F1 podcast with Bahrain, Sakir, Abu Dhabi, and the end of season. And then, as it turned out, as the two races happened, it became apparent that we had to split them up into a two-parter because there was no way we were going to get everything in within 2 hours. Or at least goodness knows how long this one will take. So, we can jump right into. We're going to jump right into. We'll start. Chronologically, we'll start with Bahrain. But actually, just to ask just a quick question to start off with between the two of you. We've been with Austria. Obviously, a track's been done twice, albeit the layout for this one was slightly different. Did I mean, what were your thoughts on the two? Because we got two kind of, I wouldn't say different style of races, but certainly they felt different to watch at least. I'll start with Cam. What the two? I mean, they same track, but they both felt quite different, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, the Bahrain track's a Bahrain track we've been used to since it's been on the calendar in 2004. I think what was quite exciting and I think different about Sakir, I mean, certainly when we went to Red Bull at the start of the season, when we went to Silverstone, there's only one real track layout that you can use on both of those tracks. Whereas with Sakir, there's a Grand Prix layout that was used for the first weekend, the one we commonly use. There's the endurance circuit that was used in 2010 and just seemed to add on an unnecessary amount of time to that. But then there was this outer circuit, which was basically almost, a lot of people kind of referred to it almost like a sort of American Oval-esque type thing in terms of the fact you're going to be carrying a lot of speed. It is, it's all about fast. There's no real corners, throughout the middle of the track. And so I think it was an interesting one because we haven't, apart from Monza, I would say, there's no real track that would have been like that Sakir outer circuit. So it made sense, I think, for them to use the two different layouts so you don't feel you're getting a carbon copy. Personally, I would have preferred, even though I did like the outer circuit, I think it surpassed my expectations, definitely. I would have preferred a different track, maybe the Dubai Autodrome in the UAE, which is a grade 1 track. But I think two different layouts like we got this weekend, it is better, I think, than what we had in Austria and what we had at Silverstone.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, similar question to you about the two tracks and differences in races we saw, but also, I mean, we've seen so many tracks sort of make their debut or return to the F1 calendar. The whole experiment of doing Bahrain and Bahrain Sakir, for purposes of differentiating the two, I'm just going to name them as they are, Bahrain and Sakir, but they are one track. It almost felt like, if a situation like this happened again and they had to do those, switch up the tracks and do two races back to back in Bahrain with those two different layouts, it worked. Like it's not something that, we wouldn't like. It's something that was a fun experience and that could be done again in the future.
And it was also an experiment which limited the amount of travel within the UAE at that time. That's not the UAE, rather the Middle East at that time. Obviously, coronavirus isn't as rampant out there as has been in Western Europe for a few months. But it made sense to limit the amount of travel going into the winter months when it was more contagious. And of course, Lewis Hamilton somehow managing to test positive. I think the unpredictability of the Sakir outer circuit actually lent itself to a very interesting Grand Prix weekend. Of the two, it's the one that I prefer by far, and we're going to get into the myriad of reasons why that is. That caught, I think it was turn 6 it became on the actual track. There were some fantastic overtakes into there. George Russell on Valtteri Bottas in the F1 race. Mick Schumacher getting a move on, I think it was Robert Schwartzman, a particularly amazing move in the F2 race as well. So yeah, a really, really entertaining track, and all of the drawbacks that we were expecting from it, the sub 1 minute lap, making the track too crowded in qualifying, the fact that there were too many laps in the race, it becoming boring. It just didn't happen. Out of nowhere, we ended up with, as has so often happened in 2020, an incredibly entertaining race from a track that we may never see on the calendar ever again.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, the second race we'll get on to, that was quite a thrilling race. But we'll talk about the first one first, and I appreciate this is 2 weeks in advance, so that 2 weeks in advance, 2 weeks back rather. So I will get up the top 10, and I think with this race, it's hard not to begin anywhere but with that first lap and that unfortunate crash for Romain Grosjean, who is obviously, he's recovering. Still, we wish him a speedy recovery, regardless of whatever stage he is at his recovery. Cam, Cam, I don't know if you're watching this live. I don't know if you caught this on a replay or a highlight or whatever. But what was your kind of instant reaction to seeing what happened on that first lap to Romain Grosjean?
I caught it on Twitter the first time, and literally I saw the crash, and I almost just stopped for a good sort of 2 or 3 minutes. I never felt that, I think, like seeing crash. The only other crash, actually, the first time I saw it that made me kind of jump back a bit was Antoine Hubert's crash last year. And of course, given the consequences of that, I think I definitely feared the worst for Romain Grosjean. But it was just, yeah, it's difficult to put into words, really, because we hadn't seen a crash, I think, as violent in terms of the fact that we had this massive fire up. We had the car literally split into two. You know, we've had very serious and violent crashes over this century that drivers have been able to, on the vast majority of cases, to walk away from. But even a crash like that, I think, just completely surpassed all other crashes in terms of how violent, in terms of just how difficult it was, I think, to watch. And I mean, the fact that Romain Grosjean came out of that with really only relatively minor burns, I think, just says a lot about how far safety in Formula One has come on, even in the last couple of years. Really, I mean, even I think without the halo, I think this crash could have been a lot worse. And I think certainly I would say, as far as 10, 20 years ago, this is a crash that I'm not sure Romain Grosjean would live to tell the tale for. So despite just how violent and how difficult that crash was to watch, I think the most important thing is that Romain Grosjean came out of that crash fairly lightly, apart from the burns, and it really speaks just how far safety has come on in Formula One.
Yeah, absolutely. And full disclosure, I guess none of the three of us, I think, have talked about this incident. So this is sort of us hearing our first reactions to it from each other, at least. And Joe, I mean, when you watch the replays, obviously he sort of swerves right, and obviously there's a car off track to his left, and so you wonder whether he's making room for that car, and then he kind of swerves right. I think it was Daniel Kvyat who got the best view of it in that AlphaTauri, kind of just seeing him just trundle over him and then head into the barrier. And as Cam said, obviously safety has come a long way. What was your, I guess, unpack the incident, I guess, from your point of view, I guess, and what you were thinking at the time, and yeah, just your reaction, I guess.
Going through everything that happened on this incident may well take a while. I'll say just to begin with that absolutely none of the blame for the crash goes to Danny Kvyat. Grosjean had two options with the slower moving cars ahead of him. He could either check up, apply the brakes, which makes sense on an opening lap, or he could do what he ended up doing, swerving to the right, going for a gap that wasn't really there, leaving absolutely no space for Kvyat to punt him into the wall. Cam's absolutely right when he says about the unique ferocity of the crash. The immediate reaction for me was, oh my God, there's fire. There have been so many drivers seriously injured or killed in the last 30 years of F1, but even back then, cars and the safety cells were designed in a way that fuel would not be released. There would not be a problem with fire and cars burning to a crisp on the side of the track. So that was an immediate shock. I was similar to Daniel Ricciardo, quite disturbed at the amount of angles we saw, the amount of times that FOM, Formula One Media, decided to repeat footage of the crash. However, since Grosjean got out within about half a minute, albeit with some burns to his hands as the least protected part of the body in terms of the overalls, I guess that sort of makes sense relative to the Hubert crash that Cam mentioned, where the cameras just tuned away immediately because we knew what was going to happen. The safety features of Formula One cars, once they cleared the fireball, once we saw the damage to the Armco barrier, it is quite unbelievable just how little structural damage there was to the safety cell of that car, how the halo, made of titanium and carbon fiber, strong but by no means invincible, was completely unaffected structurally by the crash. Just how it split the Armco barrier apart. And there are a lot of things to say about this. The quality of the overalls, how quickly Alan van der Merwe was on the scene in the medical car, the safety cell, the strength of the carbon fiber materials. The final point on this really is, well, there's two things to say about this. Number one, this is probably the fifth driver whose career /life the halo has saved. Tadasuke Makino could have been killed in Formula 2 a couple of years ago when Fukuzumi's car landed on him. He ended up being okay. Alonso's McLaren ended up going over the front of Charles Leclerc's Sauber at Spa. That could have been a serious head injury. Alex Peroni's crash in Formula 3 last year, landing on upside down onto the tyre barrier at Monza, that would have been a serious crash or a career-ending or life-ending injury. And now you've got this as well. There are other incidents that you can name that testify to the quality of and strength of the halo. Anyone who argued that this was an unaesthetic feature on a Formula One car, I don't know where they are now, and I'm quite frankly glad that the halo debate seems to have been gone forever, because the argument that they would spoil the aesthetic beauty of F1 cars is kind of ridiculous when these F1 cars might just be the ugliest we've ever had. The final point on this, and I don't mean to be macabre or disgusting, the Armco barrier splitting apart is not something which is new to Formula One, although you do need to go a long way back to see its deadly consequences. Back at the 1974 US GP at Watkins Glen, a similar incident occurred. A driver went through an Armco barrier, a fatal head injury. I don't even want to go into what happened to him. It's absolutely horrible. The point of the impact, if you look at the barrier where Grosjean hit it, the point with the halo hit would have been Grosjean's nose. There is absolutely no question that without the halo, Grosjean would not have survived that crash. It wouldn't have just been a fatality. It would have been an instant fatality. Hands down the worst crash we've had in Formula One for a long time. Honestly, thank God he's okay.
I don't think there's much more I can add to what you two have said. I think you both have covered it, I guess. And I don't really want to dwell on talking about this incident a lot longer than what we have. But I do have one final question, and it's to the both of you, really. Knowing what we know now, and obviously it's been 2 weeks since the incident, so we've had sort of time to kind of reflect and see the extent of what happened. Is there anything else the FIA could do? Is there anything else the sport could do? Like what else could be done, I guess, when you factor in obviously the halo, implementing the halo, the procedures that follow. Obviously, when you look at the guardrail was pretty much smashed. Is there anything in future that could be done, or do you feel like it was an unfortunate incident, but what came after, do you feel like went pretty much as smoothly as one can hope? I'll start with Cam on this one.
I think you've got to recognise the strengths and how far Formula One has come. We were mentioning cockpit head protection, obviously the halo being the most obvious example of that. Another thing as well in recent years, the hands device as well. The fact that a lot of energy from the crashes is now being dissipated into this device. We're seeing a lot less neck injuries as well. If the hands device wasn't here, then this potentially could have killed Grosjean as well, just because of the ferocity of that crash. I think one thing to potentially look at from this, I think a lot of people are making the points about Armco barriers. We've seen Formula One has made a lot of progress when it comes to the Tech Pro barriers in recent years, and we've seen a lot more of these barriers being put around tracks that really take in and dissipate a lot more energy. But of course, Tech Pro barriers aren't exactly foolproof, and we saw a very similar sort of crash to the one that Grosjean had at the in an F2 race in the Russian Grand Prix earlier this year, where Luca Giotto and Jack Aitken were coming through that turn 3 at Sochi, a very fast sort of left-hander collided there, and Giotto's car literally went straight through the Tech Pro barrier and burst into flames. Significantly, there's structural damage. The Tech Pro barrier takes on a lot more energy and dissipates it away from the car. But again, I think so. It's a difficult one because obviously when it comes to barriers, it's not always easy to outline an entire track with Tech Pro or tyre barriers. It's just not something that is necessarily the most effective solution on every track. And particularly, I think with this particular point, yes, the barrier kind of stuck out at a point of a service road, and that was why perhaps with that angle of the crash, it was so ferocious. But on many straights, you don't typically need Tech Pro tyre barriers. So I think that one thing they do have to look at is perhaps barriers or something in the runoff area that could either slow down cars before getting to the barriers or do something to dissipate more energy. Whether they can strengthen the Armco barriers, I think that remains to be seen. But I think there's a point to make here, with regards to safety in Formula One and with regards to these sorts of things, that safety can go on so far, but fundamentally motorsport is dangerous. It is a cliche in a sense. And I know it's something that's said after almost every serious crash, but motorsport by its nature will always be fundamentally dangerous. And however many safety changes and improvements you can make, you're not going to totally mitigate the risk. And we have seen, Antoine Hubert's crash, for example, last year was just a series of unfortunate circumstances that all just came together at the worst possible moment. And, none of the protection and none of the advancements that have happened in Formula One cars and within safety in the last few decades could have stopped what happened at Spa last year. So fundamentally, you can make every safety improvement, and the FIA have done so much that we should really not exactly celebrate, but certainly look back on and reflect and highlight how far it's come on for a driver like Romain Grosjean to come away from that crash. But fundamentally, motorsport will always be dangerous. You've got cars driving at 150, 200 miles an hour. And so all you can do is mitigate that risk as much as possible so that if the worst happens, that you've got at least an opportunity for the driver to be as safe as possible, to have the energy of a crash taken away from them as much as possible, and to just maximize their opportunity to walk out from that with little or no injury at all.
Yeah. I mean, Joe, I'll give you the floor to kind of say if there's anything you'd change or add to, I guess, what should be done, I guess, safety wise. But obviously Grosjean, luckily, I think estimates are he had 30 seconds, 28 seconds between him in the car and him in the hands of the Ian Roberts and Alan van der Merwe. So again, it pretty. I mean, 28 seconds is not. I mean, obviously it's not ideal. Obviously, you want to get out as soon as possible, but certainly come a long way since previous incidents. Joe, yeah, I'll now give you the floor. If there's, I mean, what safety thing improvements could be made to what happened 2 weeks ago, or was it pretty smooth as smooth can be?
The process was fantastic in terms of the medical car arriving on the scene, the marshals who were just, they're unpaid as well. It's just incredible how Bahrain circuit's marshals just basically leapt towards the fire to try and extinguish it. Incidentally, those 28 seconds apparently felt more like 90 for Romain Grosjean, and I would encourage anyone watching, and indeed you two, if you haven't seen it, to view Grosjean's comments in an interview with Martin Brundle only a few days later. Really, just it's difficult to listen to, but my God, is it worth it? It is fantastic that he managed to get out of it. Cam's covered just about everything. I think motorsport, there's nothing that could have been done last year to save Antoine Hubert. However, with this crash, I think the weak link in all of this, the only weak link really, is the Armco barrier. I know they have a function. I know you can't just put tech pros everywhere. But for me, in that the instant retardation of that car, the way that the Armco with half the car in it acted as a wrench which poured fuel everywhere, a tyre barrier in that instance makes a lot more sense. And indeed, that's what they replaced it with ahead of the Sakhir Grand Prix the following week. So that's my quick comment about this. Armcos are bad. We've had too many incidents with them in the past. Tech Pro or not, stick a tyre barrier there. They're not perfect, but they're a darn sight better than a barrier that can just split apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And, specifically with that corner itself, it's a very high-speed corner as well. So maybe it's targeted. Maybe the barriers have to still be targeted towards, the corners that are going to be carry more overtakes at high speeds. But anyway, on to less serious, I guess, moving on to the race results itself. As you can see, Hamilton won. I don't think, are we surprised? Obviously, is anyone surprised? I mean, was it a comfortable race, do you think, for him, or was there a chance that Verstappen could have troubled him?
Not really. Verstappen was closer than you might have thought, but honestly, it was a dominant performance from the best driver in the best car. Well deserved. There's not really a huge amount more you could say. just a great win for him.
Yeah, I think Verstappen has come out later said that he felt that Red Bull were being conservative with their tire strategy. So that's an interesting one that maybe he could have pushed Lewis closer towards the end, but pretty straightforward, I think. Obviously, I know we're critical of Alexander Albon at times, and granted he did get a podium in this race, but Joe, it does come with a bit of an asterisk, doesn't it?
Well, the massive asterisk of Sergio Perez, who had driven a fantastic race and absolutely deserving that third place, which would have been his first back-to-back podiums in his entire F1 career. And then the Mercedes power unit just expires with a couple of laps to go, forcing a safety car and cutting the end of the race short. Yeah, I think this wasn't a bad performance from Albon. There's an argument to say it was his best race performance of the year. What a shame that, as we will get onto later, the Sakir Grand Prix completely undoes all the good faith. So yeah, another podium of attrition for him, far from a bad race. But again, that third place was Perez's.
And apologies, yes, there was a pause there because I've retitled the video / podcast. Video. I mean, we'll see if this becomes podcast-worthy material. I mean, yeah, Cam, as Joe kind of alluded to, it seemed quite comfortable, and we'll talk about Sergio Perez. Obviously, it pertains to the second race because obviously he went on to get an even greater result. But it was quite unfortunate, wasn't it, seeing his engine kind of flame out, and then to a grateful Alexander Albon, who is competing with him for that second Red Bull spot, which is arguably the final undecided F1 seat on the grid at the moment.
I think had Perez not had his result this weekend, or he not been able to recover, I almost think that engine blowout at the end almost could have been a metaphor for Sergio Perez's, 2020 season, just so much potential, doing so well, exceeding expectations. But in the end, there's just a blowout at the end that ultimately stops him getting to the end, ultimately, 2021 season. I mean, yeah, Alexander Albon, obviously, I would say his podium in Mugello was, I think, a bit of luck, a bit of attrition, and admittedly with some good overtaking in that race. But it was one that I think he really benefited from Verstappen struggling. And again, in the same case with this race, I think there's no doubt that Sergio Perez should have that second Red Bull seat. I think these last couple of races have really proved that. And I think for Alexander Albon, to be honest, I think he did have a fairly decent weekend this first time around. He was quick in practice, although still behind Verstappen by quite a significant amount. I think of the second time around, perhaps the shorter circuit, I think hurt him more. But I think the result doesn't speak for how far behind Verstappen he is. And I think if you just look at the championship more widely as well, that Red Bull is still, I would say, better than the Racing Point. And Perez is about 50 points ahead. Even before this weekend, you were talking a difference of about 30 points. It could have been, nearer to 50 points before the start of this weekend if Perez didn't have that blowout. So I feel Albon, if the only thing Albon could really be doing now is trying to get himself at that second AlphaTauri seat. But I would agree with Joe. I think it feels like very much the twilight. If it's fair, and if F1 is being fair to us, then this feels like the twilight of Alexander Albon's, at least his first stint at Red Bull. What's to say he doesn't come back in the future?
Yes. Yes, Albon, obviously, it felt, there was sort of relief on his face when he came out of the car on that first weekend. Obviously, the second weekend didn't quite pan out for him. And, I guess when we talk about Perez in a bit, it will inevitably link to the Albon news. So we'll jump back to that quickly. But I guess looking at the rest of the top 10, I don't think there were huge surprises. Obviously, great weekend from McLaren, at least that first weekend, in terms of constructors. And I am trying to compile the constructor standings as we record this. But Bottas in 8th, was not a great result, and indeed it was not a great fortnight for him. Joe, is this? I mean, he's going for a bad patch at the moment. There's no doubt he's going for a bit of a rough patch, but if you count Turkey as well, the Grand Prix before this one as well, but it does feel like his stock's kind of taken a bit of a fall as a result of these 2 weeks. And I guess when you talk about him, I guess you can group together the two Grand Prix because they were both similarly disappointing results for him.
I think the one that hurts more is definitely the Sakir race, considering, and I'm sure we'll get onto that. I say this with absolutely every driver, but the Sakir race seems more embarrassing for him, although low-key he actually did perform very well. This was another kind of Monza race. He got caught in traffic when he shouldn't have. The Mercedes, as the fastest car in the field, doesn't exactly behave that well in traffic. He kept on shuffling back. Yeah, just he's not having a good time. When we do our inevitable off-season F1 driver ratings, in answering to what Warwick Feshion's put up, Bottas's stock has fallen by some margin at this point. There is a reason why people are questioning if he's good enough to be in that second Mercedes seat next year, although I do kind of feel it's a bad run of form. Turkey in particular was just awful. Final words on the top 10. I said my 3 drivers of this weekend at an earlier point. Sergio Perez, who deserved the 3rd place. Carlos Sainz coming from the back of the grid. Just another ridiculously good performance from him. And I cannot believe that anyone thinks Lando Norris is in the same league as him. I don't care if Norris finished ahead of him. Sainz's performance was amazing. And although he was benefited by the safety car cutting the end of the race short, Pierre Gasly holding on in an uncompetitive AlphaTauri on really bad hard tyres. Fantastic result as well. 6th place in what has been a pretty bad run of form recently for the team from Faenza.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, Cam, if you got anything to add about the first one before we jump to the second race?
Yeah, I mean, just adding on to the whole Bottas debate, I'm sure we'll get to Sakir, which I think was obviously a lot more damaging for Bottas.
I mean, we can link to Sakir now. I guess this is a good link to talk about Bottas.
I mean, I suppose with Valtteri Bottas, and I guess this is probably something we could come back to in the off-season. The thing is, he started the season with so much promise in a way. He came off the back of a 2019 season, which was a considerable step from 2018. At the start of 2020, there was this sense that Bottas was, in a very happy place. He admitted himself, in the off-season, he had this divorce. He'd gone through, he'd almost felt that he was a completely different person. In the first race at the Red Bull Ring, he beat Lewis Hamilton fair and square that weekend, totally on pace. And he just seemed to be in a real position to challenge Lewis Hamilton, or at least put up some sort of a fight. But these last couple of races have just completely demonstrated just how far Bottas has gone. It almost seems like he's been distracted. Almost. These last couple of races have been dominated by bad starts from Valtteri Bottas, having typically either started from pole or taken the lead from Lewis Hamilton. His start in Turkey was frankly disastrous. His start in both Bahrain races, frankly, got the amount of positions he lost in that first start in Bahrain, and then losing pole with George Russell easily outpacing him from the start this time round. And then just this time round, just his inability. He's in the fastest car in the field, and yes, the Mercedes doesn't behave well in traffic, but you'd expect it. Someone like Lewis Hamilton would be easily able to carve his way through the field. I know it's not necessarily the best comparison to go back to the race in Germany 2 years ago, but the Mercedes, in terms of the dynamics, the way the car is built, it's always been bad in traffic. Yet Lewis Hamilton could come from 14th on the grid to win races and could be able to carve his way through the field. George Russell in this race, when he fell down to 15th, had an absolutely storming last 10 laps, brought the car back up to 9th, making multiple overtakes. So it's clear that you can overtake through traffic in this Mercedes. Maybe not as well as many more midfield cars who were designed to do it. But Bottas, I don't know. I just get the sense he seems almost a bit distracted. It's almost like there's this pressure now. And I think George Russell this weekend, I think clearly outperforming Valtteri Bottas. I don't know if this is the kick he needs to retain his seat, because I do definitely think that he isn't going to be at that Mercedes team in 2022 if he keeps performing like he is now.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel a bit like recency bias, but it does feel like a long time ago where Bottas was performing really well for a Williams team. And granted, he was racing at Williams. There was little pressure, I guess, to deliver for Williams. And it does feel like since he's joined Mercedes, he's kind of taken a weight upon his shoulders. And now it almost feels as if every race, not that it could be his last, it does sound dramatic to say it, but it does feel like he's expected to, finish second place. I mean, that's how we've sort of predicted these races. We've always had Hamilton first, and quite rightly, we sort of put Bottas second. But I mean, obviously Verstappen, nip and tuck with Verstappen at least, but certainly in that kind of top three, being in that tier one of the pack. So, yeah, you mentioned George Russell, and I feel like he is sort of the story of this second race. I mean, obviously Checo Perez as well, who we'll jump back to, I'm sure, in a sec. But I mean, you mentioned Bottas, and I think he was asked on that Friday press conference, would it be embarrassing if you'd lost out to George Russell? I think he played it down, but I mean, Joe, for the majority of the race up until, and you feel free to go off on Mercedes's pit crew or their race strategy team if you like in this answer, but it was going to be the fairy tale story, and it was going to be Russell, who had never scored points before, getting a win against his much more experienced teammate. And then, yeah, it was unfortunate to see how it then kind of unraveled from that pit stop onwards, or that double stack pit stop onwards.
Yeah, and it was lovely to see, even in a completely unfamiliar car, George Russell continuing his 100% qualifying record of beating Nicholas Latifi in the Williams, which was obviously great to see. I'm not going to go off on the Mercedes pit crew. However, for a team that I have described as a perfectly well-oiled machine, they have made a lot of mistakes regarding pit stops this year. I think Mattia Binotto might have something to do with them behind the scenes. George Russell, I mean, I don't want to go on for too long about him. I was really excited when he got the call up. I was kind of hoping it would be Nico Hülkenberg replacing Lewis Hamilton, but Russell has done absolutely enough to deserve it. He, quite frankly, the fact that he won the F2 championship over Norris and Albon and has ended up in the worst car of the three of them by a mile is just the injustices of Formula One. He absolutely deserved the chance. I mean, I was expecting him to be behind Bottas. I think a lot of us were. Let's not forget that George Russell, because of his lanky frame, he barely fit into the new Mercedes. I reckon if they actually hire Russell in a couple of years for the 2022 season, they're going to have to make some quite sizable bulkhead changes in order to fit him in the car versus the much smaller, slender Hamilton. But honestly, it's not the fact that Bottas beating Russell in qualifying, I think that was kind of expected, even though it's an unfamiliar track. I think anyone in their right frame of mind would have predicted Bottas on pole, but Russell should have been nowhere near as close as he was. 2/1000ths of a second. It's just absolutely crazy for a guy who's his first go in the car on a track that he'd probably not done that much simulator work for as well. In terms of the race, Cam's absolutely right. The second phase of the start, he absolutely got the legs on Bottas, got in the lead. After 25 laps or so, I think it was Guido van der Garde tweeting that he was already sick of Russell Mercedes dominance in Formula One. It was just looking that Hamilton-esque. Bottas, in fairness to him, second stint was closing in. His race pace was good. I, again, don't think he had a particularly bad weekend at Sakir relative to recent Grand Prix weekends. But especially that move that Russell pulled on him towards the end of the race, inside to that track adjoining section, I think it was turn 6. It was a real statement of intent. And I'm going to talk about the channel The Race in a few minutes about Alexander Albon. They put up a pretty comprehensive video of saying that although Bottas is contracted to Mercedes next year, it's not completely out of the realms of possibility that Mercedes bite the bullet and appoint George Russell for that second Mercedes seat.
And yes, there we go. Here's the thing. I mean, we've praised Russell, and that's entirely fair given his outstanding performance this weekend. I mean, but then there were also some people who kind of, I think, and some drivers also, spoke about this in the post-race conference, that it just goes to show how dominant that Mercedes car is. And I'm sure no one explicitly said it, but I'm sure some of them were thinking, put me in the Mercedes car and I could produce a similar result to George Russell. Is that fair, or is that, should we give more credit to George Russell, or is there a legitimate case to say that that Mercedes car could help most drivers into that top spot. Joe, you have something to say on that?
Yeah, he performed very well, but he still finished 9th. Mercedes have made mistakes with Lewis Hamilton earlier this year, and he was such a supreme driver in terms of strategy and controlling the car that he was able to come back and win. Like, they made minor mistakes in Portugal, in Turkey as well, from a bad qualifying position, and yet he managed to absolutely dominate both of those races. Not taking anything away from Russell, but the idea of tearing down Hamilton's reputation in particular because of one amazing performance from Russell, I don't understand, especially with British motorsport fans, why there isn't a move to just glorify both drivers. These are two of the generational talents of Formula One. Hamilton of the late noughties, Russell of the late teens. I don't see why we have to tear down Hamilton's reputation as one of the greatest of all time just because he's in a great car. Name a single driver who won multiple championships in Formula One who did not do so in the best car. I defy you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, people are proud of their countrymen, Joe. I not to make this about football, but you see it with American football fans when, the likes of Gio Reyna or Weston McKennie or, some of the young Americans do well in on the European stage. But yeah, Cam, is the praise going a bit overboard, or is it merited given his performance?
I think with George Russell, you've got to remember that George Russell was only as low as he was because he got that late puncture. And if he didn't have that puncture, we saw the way he was sort of sizing his way back through the field. I think obviously if you had Lewis Hamilton in that car and he didn't have the puncture, you would easily have backed him to overtake Sergio Perez in a way that I don't think you would have been as confident doing with George Russell. But it speaks so much just how brilliant a driver Lewis Hamilton is. The thing is, you can have the best machinery in the world, but you have to perform to the standard of that machinery. And if you want to win as well, you've got to take it beyond what the machinery can do. That's why Max Verstappen is such a highly rated driver, because he takes that Red Bull, arguably, yes, it's the second best car on the grid, but the way that he can get it in with the Mercedes, arguably the W11, that unarguably the most dominant car in Formula One since the F2004, the way that Max Verstappen can put that RB16, which has a lot of balance issues, is not the easiest car to drive, up consistently with the Mercedes, says a lot about his talent. And considerably with Lewis Hamilton as well. You have someone, this is the guy with the most poles in Formula One history, the most wins in Formula One history, a joint highest amount of championships. He's someone who just always gets the best out of those cars. We see time and time again the gap between Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas in qualifying. The way in Turkey, for example, Lewis Hamilton started sixth, had some mistakes throughout that race, yet still managed to finish 30 seconds ahead in the field in just absolutely extremely difficult conditions. You can't argue that just because of this situation with George Russell that Lewis Hamilton is any less of a driver. I do think this is, the W11 is a very quick car, and I think anyone who sits in it is going to be at the front of the field. But in terms of just how seismic the advantage that Lewis Hamilton has, no other driver, not even Max Verstappen, I think, not even perhaps Michael Schumacher at his prime, I think could be as dominant as Lewis Hamilton is able to be in that car.
There we go. That would be some show where we kind of go back through the eras and compare drivers. Obviously, the sport has changed a lot, but yeah, it's to kind of final kind of. And we've heard from you, Cam, about you believe Russell will be in the Mercedes car by 2022, and Bottas will be on his way out. Joe, I don't know if you said it or not, but your thoughts on their lineup moving forward? How soon are we going to likely see George Russell in a Mercedes car?
It's dependent on a number of things. I don't think he'll be in the car next year because Bottas has a contract at Mercedes. Williams have, taken the option for Russell next year. The only way that can change is, and I still think it's unlikely, but the fact it keeps getting delayed means it's a possibility. If Lewis Hamilton does not renew his Mercedes contract for whatever reason, there's allegations about salary demands that Mercedes are unwilling to meet. The fact he's, broken basically every record there is. Does he want to continue into a new era starting in 2022? There's a whole host of reasons why. I don't think it's inevitable that Mercedes get rid of Bottas. I think it kind of more depends on what Hamilton does in the next year or so. Either way, though, Russell is going to be at Mercedes in 2022, if not necessarily next year.
Yeah, there's no question. And yes, as you've alluded to, the Hamilton deal is still not confirmed yet. I don't think Toto Wolff has completely confirmed his future yet with the team as well. So we sort of assume it's a done deal, but obviously it's not been officially confirmed. Obviously the other major story, and we talked about how his podium went up in flames 2 weeks ago, and then he came back, and a week later, Checo Perez kind of had this sort of redemptive story, and that in one in which he kind of, I mean, you think about it, Cam, he was the back of the grid at the first lap. He had to pit early. There was a problem, and then it was an incredible thing to see him kind of rise up to the top, and then maintain a pretty sizable gap to the second place car, being Esteban Ocon. So, I mean, quite simply, has this win, he deserves to be in the sport for next year. I mean, it's weird to talk about. It's a weird thing to ask about a driver who's just won a race, with their future on the line. But it would feel like a tragedy if he wasn't.
I think firstly, to talk about that performance specifically, Daniel Ricciardo said it after the race. The fact that someone who fell to last on the first lap managed to win the race, when it's an opportunity missed for drivers like Ricciardo, like Carlos Sainz, Ocon, Lance Stroll. This was a real opportunity on a day where Mercedes made quite terminal errors, really, to their race, and without Max Verstappen for someone else to win, and obviously Perez doing that, and a lot of these other drivers, Perez he made the overtakes he needed to throughout the fields. This was a race that he won, part, I would say, because of luck. Obviously, Mercedes having their pit stop strategy errors. I think if that didn't happen, obviously they would have finished ahead of Perez. I think also as well, the errors I think that McLaren and Renault made in pitting Carlos Sainz and Daniel Ricciardo just as that virtual safety car period for Nicholas Latifi's car was ending. Had that virtual safety car, I think, gone on longer, sort of 10, 20 seconds longer, or had they waited to pit under the safety car that came out after Jack Aitken's crash, then I do think Sainz and Ricciardo would have finished ahead of Perez. But that's not to take anything away from Perez. He made the overtakes he had to do throughout the field, especially those overtakes on his teammate Lance Stroll, on Esteban Ocon, crucial overtakes by the end of the race. And he did them so clinically, in the fact that, he didn't faff around. He made those overtakes almost as soon as he could. He did them cleanly as well, fair racing. And he just took advantage of everything that he had. And I mean, once he got to the front of the field and he pulled out this gap in the end of 10 seconds, I think it just shows ultimately Sergio Perez has always been at the head of the midfield. He is arguably, I would say, has the best racecraft of, I think, of any midfield driver we've had in the last decade. And the fact that he still doesn't have a seat in Formula One next year is an absolute tragedy. And again, we talked about Perez's engine, possibly the metaphor for his career. But I think for Alexander Albon, I think there's only one metaphor that I think would really describe, if there is justice in Formula One, Sergio Perez overtaking Alexander Albon round about lap 20, just the sign of, Perez taking his seat for next season. I feel if that's the metaphor for that race, Perez was he took his opportunity. He was clinical in his overtaking. He took advantage of the bad luck that others had to put him in that position. And once he was in that position, George Russell, we don't know what might have happened if George Russell didn't have that puncture, but Perez did everything he needed to do. And it feels like if there is any sort of justice in Formula One, he'll be in that second Red Bull seat next year.
Yeah. I mean, it did feel like as you kind of alluded to, kind of a sprint for from the midfield teams towards the end. As soon as Mercedes kind of realized they were in trouble, it felt like a bit of a sprint for those midfield cars to kind of get themselves into a podium position. And Racing Point obviously benefited. And in fact, I'll put the Constructors' Championship up just a sec, because I don't think it's worth showing. I mean, the driver standings to the driver standings. I think the Constructors one's the one that everyone's kind of looking at more than the drivers, which is a weird thing, I guess, because everyone's sort of normally fixated on the driver standings. It's a bit weird that the Constructors one has kind of taken the focus. But Joey, I mean, actually, I'll quickly flash up the driver standings, because Perez he's fourth. He is the sort of best of the rest, I guess. If we put the top three on a class of their own, he is best of the rest. And is there anything more he has to do to earn a seat now? Or is there anything? And I mean, by contrast, I mean, Alex Albon's not even in that top 7 of the drivers' standings. Is there anything more? What has to happen for him to kind of, earn his spot? Does he have to win in Abu Dhabi? And I say that jokingly, but that is sort of where at least public perception is of where those two are in terms of comparing them.
Do I have license to go on for as long as I'd like to on this?
Sure. Yeah, go for it. Why not?
Okay, right. So the fact that Sergio Perez is likely to finish 4th in the championship and doesn't have a drive for next year, I don't even have to go into how ridiculous that is. I can't remember any occasion, maybe even in the history of Formula One, where the guy who's finished 4th in the championship has been out of a drive for next year because he's not been able to get a drive, as opposed to a retirement or, God forbid, a fatality. It's absolutely crazy that in what has been Sergio Perez's best year in Formula One, even relative to the performance of the Racing Point Mercedes 2019 that he's in, it got even better this weekend. He deserved that podium in Bahrain, and he won this race, for me, mostly on merit. Yeah, you can say Verstappen and Leclerc were taken out on lap 1. Leclerc wouldn't have had the pace in that Ferrari. I don't know how he managed to qualify 4th. Verstappen's, he's in bad form, truly speaking. The accident on lap 1, his retirement, is honestly his fault, not Perez or Leclerc. So he performed like legitimately on merit, as Cam said. Lap 1, he was literally facing backwards, and yet he somehow came through to win the race. Driver of the day by a country mile. By contrast, there was a car that should have won this race, with both Mercedes failing, Verstappen out on lap 1. It should have been Alexander Albon in the second best car on the grid, the Red Bull RB16. In truth, he qualified 12th and finished 6th. I'm going to be paraphrasing a lot of what Scott Mitchell of the race, and I encourage you to go and watch that video on YouTube, has said already about this. There is absolutely no competitive, commercial, or structural reason why Red Bull should appoint Alex Albon for next year over Sergio Perez. What's most worrying about Albon isn't the fact that he's so far behind Verstappen, which he still is. It's the fact that there is absolutely no evidence that he is improving or that he will improve in the near future. The pace deficit is still there. In fact, this Sakir Grand Prix deficit, in terms of percentages, is one of the strongest of the year. And even if you were to take away the horrible weekend he had in Russia, his second half of the season, when he should have made massive inroads into Verstappen's advantage, is only negligibly better than his first half of the season. I think in terms of performance difference, it's 0.08% of a gain on Verstappen, and that's if you discount the disastrous weekend in Sochi. The biggest frustration about Alexander Albon apparently is the fact that after an apparent comeback, i.e. a podium in Bahrain, there's just another setback around the corner. Let's not forget that he also binned the car in free practice in Bahrain, which would have cost several million euros. The simple fact of the matter is this: Alexander Albon has been given more chances in that Red Bull than Kvyat was, than Pierre Gasly was, and that Sainz was in that Toro Rosso before he ended up leaving the whole program. There is no reason why Alexander Albon deserves that seat over Sergio Perez. And if they have him in that second seat for next year, quite frankly, it makes this entire Red Bull driver program and structure look completely ridiculous and hypocritical. The fatal mistake Red Bull made this year was announcing Gasly to be retained for AlphaTauri and not saying what was happening with Albon at the same time. It would have made sense at that point to say that both Albon and Gasly would be at AlphaTauri next year, and they would leave that second Red Bull seat open. Maybe for Perez, maybe for Hülkenberg, maybe even for Yuki Tsunoda. What's happened is that not only does it look like that Alexander Albon is going to lose his Red Bull seat on merit, it also means, as this delay has gone on and this apparent ultimatum for Albon to perform has gone on, there is now very little justification for him to have the AlphaTauri seat next year. The pressure has gotten to him that much. I will repeat what I've said twice already to finish this. There is no competitive reason why Alexander Albon should be in that second Red Bull seat next year over Sergio Perez. And if Red Bull have him for a second season after the year he's had, they clearly have absolutely no interest in winning in Formula One.
I feel like you judge, jury, and execution. I feel like you've just, you've made it's like you're speaking it into existence now.
If he wins in Abu Dhabi, just quickly, doesn't change my opinion whatsoever.
Okay,
he's done.
Okay, I granted, stranger things have happened. I've seen Pastor Maldonado win a Grand Prix. Stranger things have happened, but
but he had race pace, didn't he?
I guess so. So Albon has all drivers have a chance, realistically. I mean, in theory, of winning the Grand Prix. Whether he will, I don't know. But I think, I feel for Albon. I guess as on the human side, I feel for him because he is under a lot of pressure. And I think on the show I've sort of said how F1 drivers, I feel like there's a lot more pressure on them to succeed than in most other sports as well. But it is the nature of the sport, I guess, unfortunately. I don't know if there's a whole lot more to add. I mean, obviously, Verstappen and Leclerc took each other out. I know Eleanor Burgess, another panelist, was pretty annoyed at that, being a Verstappen fan. So I don't know. It was I suppose it was Leclerc's fault, but it happens. I guess racing incidents.
Perez spinning around was Leclerc's fault. There was no contact on Verstappen. His incident was entirely trying to avoid it and going off. Verstappen's made silly mistakes at Bahrain before at that point in the track. That retirement is for me almost entirely on him, honestly.
Really interesting. Well, I'm sure she'd have fought you on that point, but she's not here.
She's not here, so I don't care.
Exactly. We move. Obviously, shout out to Ocon for his podium, second place. Again, it was a weird race. Obviously, the midfield kind of got a chance to shine, and he took his chance. So fair play to him. And obviously, Lance Stroll got a third place as well. After we didn't talk about it in the first race, but he did have a bit of quite a surreal incident where his car was flipped around in the first Grand Prix. But he comes third, and Lawrence Stroll must have been a very happy man that Sunday. So I don't know if there's a whole. I don't know why there's a whole much to add. I mean, Abu Dhabi. I'll get the track thing up. I've had it up for a bit. Just having a look at it. It's sort of a mixed first sector, I guess. Some really fast straights in terms of the second sector, and then a bit of a more of a cornering emphasis on the third sector. 55 laps, I believe. Yes, 55 laps for this track. Just quickly, because I mean, granted, it's the final race. I expect a pretty straightforward result, but for the two Mercedes cars, whoever it is that is driving, because we don't know about if Lewis Hamilton will be there. It might be George Russell getting a second chance. But again, we expect Mercedes to do well. Is there any other midfield team that could separate themselves, Joe? Because as we put the constructor standings up, third to that battle between Racing Point, McLaren, and Renault is still relatively on a knife edge.
I'm sure there is a midfield team that benefits from the structure of the Yas Marina circuit. However, as we've seen over the last 10 years, the track is so bad for wheel-to-wheel racing and overtaking that we probably won't see it. To end my comments, I will paraphrase Kimi Räikkönen when he first drove the track in 2009. First sector is pretty good. Second and third sectors are a bit synonym for excrement.
It's a fair point looking at it. Cam, any sort of expectations, any thoughts looking ahead to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix?
I mean, the track is god awful. Really, I mean, you've got two overtaking zones, really, obviously, at the end of those two straights, but that's really the only places on the track that you can actually get some overtaking done. And when you're not on those two straights, it's so difficult because of the way the track's designed to just follow a car in front of you. But yeah, Joe's right. Overtaking it is extremely difficult. I mean, the long straights give Racing Point an advantage, definitely. And I think particularly if you have a situation where you're going to be coming through the field, obviously the Mercedes power, helps Racing Point there. They're the ones, if there's going to be any overtaking, who are going to get to the front. But yeah, I don't see anyone particularly standing out. I see Ferrari struggling here. Not that that's particularly relevant to the battle for the constructors, but yeah, I think it's just going to be your sort of bog standard 2020 weekend. I think the interesting thing to see really is who will be in that Mercedes seat. I personally don't think Lewis Hamilton should race, even if he has done his COVID isolation. I think you have to, firstly consider the fact that he has been symptomatic. COVID symptoms, do linger. As Dominic Cummings proved early in the year, you have eye issues that can emerge from COVID as well. And obviously, you need to be ensuring as a Formula One driver, you can't have any dizziness at all. You've got to be able as well to, I think for Lewis Hamilton, just the impacts of COVID and the fact he doesn't need to race. That's the thing. He's won the championship. There's no need for Lewis Hamilton to race. And perhaps it's another opportunity for Mercedes to see what George Russell can do, especially given what happened at the conclusion of the race in Bahrain. So I think it makes more sense for them to continue as they did in that second Bahrain race.
Can I just jump in on this quickly? Further to everything that Cam said, because this is a needless weekend for Lewis Hamilton. He doesn't need to come back. It's only one weekend after Sakir, so in terms of isolation, it doesn't really make sense. Lewis Hamilton's also in contention for Sports Personality of the Year. There are a lot of people who still criticise Lewis Hamilton for a number of reasons. How classy would it be if he was to step aside voluntarily just for one weekend to usher in the next generation, not just of Formula One drivers, but British Formula One drivers? Russell's done enough to earn that seat. It would be a classy move of Hamilton to let him see out the season. Whether or not he's coming back next year, in terms of Hamilton, I think is kind of a vexed question at the moment. Russell has done enough to get a second chance. Boy, I would love to see him get his first win this weekend.
Yeah, it would be quite the finale, and it would be quite, again, we talk about Perez having a bit of a redemptive story over the 2 weeks of Bahrain. This would be the sort of redemptive story for Russell. So yeah, it would be exciting to see. And yeah, like you said, Hamilton doesn't really have much reason to be there. I am currently just looking for a tweet from the F1 account. But while I look for that, obviously a few bits of news came through. Obviously, the W Series announced their calendar, their companion races with the F1 for 2021, which is pretty exciting. The likes of Jamie Chadwick, the likes of a lot of a lot of female drivers getting a chance to kind of go side by side in terms of having their race with the F1 with the F1 championship. That's going to be pretty exciting. Obviously F2, we had the winner crowned. It was Mick Schumacher, and it caps off a week in which, or at least that sort of, and this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that driver lineup, a graphic that the F1 Twitter account use. Apologies for those who listen to audio because you're not going to be able to see it. But it does look. I mean, he pretty much got his seat, and Mazepin was announced pretty much a day beforehand, and obviously Nikita Mazepin's been in the news at the time of recording. Nikita Mazepin has been in the news for some unsavory things on social media, which isn't great. I don't really want to go into them, but Joe, I mean, just quickly, I mean, those were the two guys we sort of predicted for weeks now, so I wasn't really surprised to see them confirmed.
The one quick comment I'd make about Nikita Mazepin, let's not even go into the social media stuff. His driving in the Sakir feature race in Formula 2, defending positions. I have seen armies defend positions less aggressively than Nikita Mazepin did. Drugovich is very lucky to have escaped serious injury when he was pushing him towards the wall. So yeah, I'm not even going to go into it. On merit, does he deserve a seat? Is he ready for Formula 1? It doesn't even matter. The point is that there are far better drivers that were available for that position. It's the same argument that we've been making about Perez, Hülkenberg. It's not that other drivers aren't worthy of Formula 1. It's just that they're better. Schumacher, unsurprising that he came through in the end. He went into the weekend with such an advantage over Callum Ilott. It's just a real shame as a fan of Callum Ilott that not only is he not going to be in F1 next year, but because he's not really a pay driver and hasn't got a huge amount of funding, there's a good chance he's not going to be in Formula 2 either, which is incredibly sad after the season he's had.
Yeah. Also, I forgot to mention that, yes, it's a shame that Romain Grosjean will not be in Abu Dhabi either. He is back in Switzerland, I believe, recovering from his injury. It's a shame because obviously this is his, well, we assume this will be his last Formula One race in his career. So, yeah. But regardless, you know, best wishes to him. He's had a very excellent career in the sport and excited to see what kind of he goes on to do next. Cam, I mean, your thoughts? I mean, Mazepin, Schumacher, we sort of predicted those two would be in. And certainly those were the two seats that kind of we weren't. I mean, Haas, we knew were going to go in a different direction. They've now made their decision. And granted, you know, what should be, I mean, it's quite early to kind of cast predictions on what these two are going to do in the car next year. But it's going to be a bit of a learning year for those two, you'd expect.
No, definitely. I think firstly, with regards to the news with Nikita Mazepin, I think it's absolutely shocking what was posted on his social media account. I think that alone should justify him losing his seat next year. I think it's absolutely shocking. But with regards to obviously the point of Mazepin and Schumacher, I think it reflects what Haas need, what Haas want at the moment. They need money. It's a team that is cash strapped. We know that Gene Haas is someone who has considered pulling out of F1 because of the financial issues. Nikita Mazepin brings Ural Kali. It brings money to Haas. Although I'm not sure Haas would have necessarily considered bringing Russian money, an American team, as perhaps their best solution. But there you go. And then of course Mick Schumacher as well brings in. I think firstly the name. I think is ideal to have the Schumacher brand back in Formula One. There's significant connections to the German financial companies. I think Deutsche Wermbuchtung. I hope I haven't absolutely butchered that pronunciation, but significant money coming in from there. You've got the Ferrari links as well, and we know that in a way that Alfa Romeo have almost become a B team to Ferrari. I think Haas are very increasingly coming on that line. Callum Ilott should be in that seat instead of Nikita Mazepin. It is just a shame that he isn't a paid driver, and I think in general, just looking at that lineup at the moment, Formula One is in just such a sad and sorry state at the moment, where you can justify drivers like Nikita Mazepin, Nicholas Latifi, who, granted they're good drivers, they perform well in their junior careers, but you have arguably far better drivers, so we don't know what's happening with Sergio Perez at the moment, but Nico Hülkenberg, the super sub this season, he's come in, he's performed far better than any of those two drivers have ever done. And it's just a sad and sorry state, the way that paid drivers have just, it seems having money can buy you so much more than talent. And I know that's the thing that's been in F1 throughout the entirety of, the sport. Paid drivers have always been a thing. But it seems paid drivers and the development of the driver academies now has just completely reduced the ability for drivers without the links to money or without links to any team to come through. And I think that is a very sorry state of affairs for the sport.
Yeah, I mean, if there was complete parity and money wasn't an issue and drivers were picked on merit, I dare say the lineup would be very different to how it looks at the moment. But it's a business, I guess. So yeah, it's. I mean, look, the lineup's pretty much. I think it's pretty much sorted. I guess that final Red Bull seat. We've obviously talked a lot about it, so I feel like we sort of know what we predict the driver lineup to be in 2021. Just quickly, finally, some news that's kind of broken this afternoon. The FIA have rejected Ferrari's request to get Carlos Sainz to take part in the postseason test in Abu Dhabi. This comes after they granted Renault an exception for Fernando Alonso because the test was designed for young drivers as a result of coronavirus cost-saving measures. However, Fernando Alonso will be taking part for Renault. In addition, Red Bull will be using Sebastian Buemi, which is a bit of a throwback because he's not been in an F1 car for a while. Yes, Joe, he's their reserve driver.
How many young drivers do Red Bull have that they're letting down every bloody year, and now they're giving Buemi the chance to test an F1 car?
I hear Jaime Alguersuari is just waiting on that phone call to join next.
They've probably got speed lined up over the likes of Dennis Hauger and Yuri Vips.
Yeah.
Red Bull's junior driver. I'm going to get into a rant next week probably about this, but Red Bull's young driver program is antithetical to the idea of a young driver program. Helmut Marko and Christian Horner should be ashamed of themselves.
Yes. Well, anyway.
So saying a slightly lighter note, how many years has it been since Jaime Alguersuari's actually stepped into a Formula One car? Now he's this sort of resident DJ.
I didn't know he was a resident DJ.
It's been like 5-6 years since he was in a Formula E car, let alone a Formula One car.
I did not know he was a resident DJ. Now I have found out about him. Wow. Okay, this is a bit of a revelation for me. And he has topped the iTunes album chart in 2011. So he's got arguably a #1 album on iTunes.
I feel I need to start playing his music on my show next term. Definitely.
Maybe. By the way, Joe, you know how we were talking about music playlists? Martin Garrix has curated the F1 playlist for Abu Dhabi. This came after the Super M, the K-pop group, did the playlist for the Sakir Grand Prix. So just a bit of an allusion to the last time we did this, where we went through Charles Leclerc's taste in music, and there was disappointingly mainstream. But I'm going off topic. The other experienced driver that's been given an exception is Robert Kubica, who will test for Alfa Romeo. So Ferrari saw that, wanted Sainz in their car for that postseason test, and that has been rejected, despite Alonso, Buemi, and Kubica all being able to. And interesting enough, the BBC report has cited the Horse Whisperer Twitter account, which is apparently regarded associated with the Ferrari team. I guess like a sort of a burner Twitter account, like a fake Twitter account, that one of those ones that you make up there, which tweeted out something questioning why the FIA have let Alonso, who's done 312 Grand Prix, into the test, but not let Sainz, who's done 117, and so on. So yes, I think Yuki Tsunoda is also set to test for Toro Rosso AlphaTauri, if I'm not mistaken. So it's young drivers plus Alonso, Buemi, and Kubica. So, but they have not let Sainz test, and they've not let Sebastian Vettel test, as Ferrari were willing to let Vettel test for what will be Aston Martin, now is Racing Point. So some interesting stuff there. But that'll probably do it for us. We've gone an hour and 13 minutes, which is, this justifies the two-parter decision. My thanks to Cam Hall for coming on, for Joe Spagnoli, as always. We will try, as we said, we will try to do one more of these next week to kind of wrap up Abu Dhabi in the season. Fingers crossed. It might be a pre-record, it might be live. We'll work it out then. And therefore, but until then, enjoy the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. I didn't really ask you guys for predictions, but I'm guessing we're thinking Mercedes, Verstappen.
Russell, Verstappen, Sainz.
Interesting. Okay, Cam?
I will say Russell, Bottas, Verstappen. I think it's just going to be a very 2020 race, I think.
I'm going to go out there and say Russell, Perez, Albon, just to spice up. And I feel like Verstappen's just not going to end the year very well in general. So with that, there's our predictions. You can quote us on that next week, I'm sure. But again, thank you for YouTube for coming on. This has been the 4th Raw Sport F1 special sort of weekly show, and we'll be back at some point soon. So thank you for watching or listening.